What if I told you that World War II, this massive world-changing conflict, came down to a handful of decisions, a few critical weeks and moments where history could have gone the other way? What if Britain had fallen? What if Moscow had collapsed? What if America had stayed out just a little longer? Tonight, we're not talking about myths. We're uncovering the terrifying reality of how close Adolf Hitler actually came to winning World War II. The victories, the turning points, the mistakes, and the razor-thin moments that changed the fate of the world. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might completely change how you see history forever. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Tonight, we step into the shadow of a question that still chills historians, soldiers, and survivors alike. How close did Adolf Hitler actually come to winning World War II? Not in myth, not in propaganda, but in reality. To answer that, we must return to a Europe trembling in 1939, when the world underestimated a dictator and nearly paid the ultimate price. In September 1939, the armies of Adolf Hitler stormed into Poland. The invasion was swift, brutal, mechanized. Within weeks, Poland collapsed. But what shocked the world wasn't just the speed, it was the method. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, tanks slicing through defensive lines, dive bombers screaming from the sky, radios coordinating movements in real time. It was warfare reborn, faster, deadlier, terrifyingly modern. France and Britain declared war. Yet when German forces turned west in 1940, few believed France, victor of World War I, could fall. It fell in 6 weeks. The German army bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, surged through the Ardennes, and split Allied forces apart. Paris was occupied. Europe watched in disbelief as Winston Churchill stood before the British people and uttered words that would echo through history: "We shall never surrender." But surrender seemed plausible. By mid-1940, Hitler controlled Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Italy joined his side. The Soviet Union was bound to him in a fragile non-aggression pact. The United States remained neutral. At that moment, summer 1940, Hitler stood closer to victory than at any other point in the war. Britain stood alone. And if Britain fell, the war in Europe would effectively be over. The skies above southern England became the next battlefield. The Battle of Britain was not merely a clash of aircraft. It was a contest of endurance, industry, and morale. The German Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force. Airfields were bombed, cities burned, civilians huddled in underground stations as bombs fell night after night. For a time, the outcome hung in balance. But then came one of Hitler's first fatal miscalculations. Instead of focusing solely on military airfields, he shifted to bombing London in retaliation. That decision allowed the Royal Air Force to recover. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, never came. Hitler blinked, and history shifted. Yet even after failing to conquer Britain, Hitler's position remained formidable. In June 1941, he launched the most ambitious invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. At first, it was devastation on an unimaginable scale. Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, hundreds of thousands captured. Entire regions fell within weeks. German forces reached the gates of Moscow. Leningrad was besieged. Ukraine was occupied. Had Moscow fallen before winter, had Soviet resistance collapsed, had German supply lines held, the war may have ended differently. But winter came, and with it, Russian resilience. The Wehrmacht, unprepared for sub-zero temperatures, stalled. Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia. The Red Army counterattacked. For the first time, the German army was forced into retreat. Still, Hitler was not finished. In 1942, he turned south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized war. Without it, Germany would suffocate. The battle that followed would become the turning point of the European war. Stalingrad. For months, Soldiers fought building to building, room to room. The city was reduced to rubble. Civilians starved. Both sides suffered horrific casualties. Then the encirclement. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Despite pleas from his generals, Hitler refused retreat. He promised relief that never came. In February 1943, what remained of the Sixth Army surrendered. An entire field army, gone. The myth of German invincibility shattered. But we must ask again, how close did he truly come? There were moments, critical, fragile moments, when the outcome was not predetermined. If Britain had negotiated peace in 1940, if the Luftwaffe had destroyed the RAF, if the invasion of the Soviet Union had been delayed until better prepared, if Japan had coordinated strategy more closely with Germany, if Hitler had listened to his generals instead of his ideology, if the United States had remained isolated longer, each if represents a fork in history's road. And then came December 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. Soon, American industry began producing ships, tanks, aircraft in numbers Germany could never match. The Soviet Union, fueled by industrial relocation and sheer manpower, pushed westward. Britain endured. Resistance movements grew stronger. Germany found itself fighting a three-front war, west, east, and south. The war Hitler had begun became the war he could not win. By 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy. Soviet forces advanced relentlessly from the east. German cities were bombed daily. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. In a bunker beneath the ruins of his capital, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The Third Reich collapsed days later. So, how close did he come? Closer than we are comfortable admitting. In 1940, victory was within reach. In 1942, German forces stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga River. But Hitler's greatest enemy was not Britain, not America, not even the Soviet Union. It was his own arrogance. He overestimated his opponents. He allowed ideology to override strategy. He opened too many fronts. He refused tactical retreats. He declared war on industrial giants he could not outproduce. World War II was not won by inevitability. It was won by resilience, by factory workers in Detroit, by pilots in the skies of Britain, by Soviet soldiers freezing outside Moscow, by resistance fighters sabotaging rail lines, by countless unnamed civilians who refused to break. History reminds us that dictators can appear unstoppable until they overreach. The terrifying truth is this: Hitler did not lose because he was weak. He lost. The world, eventually, united against him. And had even one or two decisions gone differently in those early years, we might be living in a very different world. That is how close he came. Not close enough to win, but close enough to haunt history forever. In the autumn of 1939, Europe did not yet understand that it was witnessing the birth of a new kind of war. When Adolf Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland, the world expected another long, grinding conflict like the trenches of 1914. What it saw instead was something terrifyingly different. Columns of German tanks moved with mechanical precision across the Polish countryside, supported by dive bombers that screamed from the sky. Communications crackled over radios mounted inside armored vehicles, coordinating movements in real time. Infantry followed swiftly behind, not marching into machine gun fire as in the last war, but advancing through shattered defensive lines already torn open by armor and air power. Within weeks, Poland was crushed. The speed of the collapse shocked observers. It was not simply defeat, it was disintegration. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it would redefine military strategy. It was not merely about tanks or aircraft alone. It was about concentration, coordination, and psychological shock. The German Wehrmacht did not spread evenly across the front. It punched through at specific weak points, encircled entire armies, and severed communication and supply lines before defenders could react. Soldiers found themselves surrounded before they fully understood the battle had begun. Civilians fled, roads clogged with refugees, bombed from above. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was futile, and it would be crushed swiftly. In April 1940, the lightning struck north. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway followed after fierce but brief fighting. The speed of these campaigns ensured German control over critical sea routes and access to Swedish iron ore, a resource essential for sustaining war production. Europe watched anxiously, yet many still believed France, the hardened victor of the First World War, would hold the line. France had prepared for another static war. Along its border with Germany stood the formidable Maginot Line, a series of concrete fortifications, artillery emplacements, and underground railways. It was a monument to the trauma of the trenches, built to prevent another invasion. But it was built to stop yesterday's war. In May 1940, German forces launched their western offensive. Rather than smashing directly into the Maginot Line, they advanced through the Ardennes forest, a region Allied planners considered too dense and rugged for large armored formations. It was a gamble of extraordinary risk. Narrow roads choked with tanks could have been easy targets if detected. Yet the Allies failed to anticipate the scale and speed of the maneuver. German armored divisions burst through at Sedan, crossing the Meuse River and driving westward toward the English Channel. The effect was devastating. Allied armies that had advanced into Belgium were suddenly cut off from the south. British and French troops found themselves trapped near the coast at Dunkirk. The evacuation that followed, rescued by a flotilla of naval and civilian vessels, was heroic, but it was also a retreat. Equipment was abandoned, artillery left behind. The core of the British Army survived, but France stood exposed. Within 6 weeks of the initial assault, Paris fell. The image of German troops marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe stunned the world. The French government collapsed, replaced in part by the Vichy regime that collaborated with Berlin. The speed of France's defeat was almost incomprehensible. A nation that had endured 4 years of trench warfare in the previous conflict had been overwhelmed in just over a month. The psychological impact rippled across continents. By the summer of 1940, Germany controlled Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Italy had joined the Axis cause, seeking its own imperial ambitions. Across much of Europe, swastika banners flew from government buildings. Rail networks, factories, ports, all were absorbed into the expanding machinery of the Third Reich. For the first time, Germany commanded the industrial resources and manpower of an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. The rapid conquests were not solely military triumphs. They were also triumphs of perception. Nations that might have resisted, hesitated, fearing the unstoppable force they had witnessed. Neutral countries recalculated their positions. Leaders questioned whether continued opposition was worth national annihilation. The myth of German invincibility took root, fed by propaganda films that showcased columns of tanks rolling endlessly forward, aircraft formations darkening the skies, soldiers raising flags over captured capitals. Yet beneath the spectacle lay careful preparation. German rearmament throughout the 1930s had focused on mobility and integration of forces. Commanders such as Heinz Guderian emphasized the use of armored divisions operating independently but supported by close air power. Training exercises rehearsed rapid breakthroughs and encirclements. Industrial production prioritized vehicles, radios, and aircraft capable of sustaining fast offensives. When war came, Germany did not improvise Blitzkrieg. It executed a doctrine refined over years. Still, chance and daring played their roles. The Ardennes breakthrough could have failed under heavier resistance. Allied air attacks on congested German columns might have inflicted catastrophe. Sea losses. Political indecision within the Allied command structure contributed to paralysis. In war, momentum can be as decisive as numbers, and Germany seized it relentlessly. Each victory compounded the next, creating a cascade effect in which opponents struggled to regain balance. For civilians across occupied Europe, the lightning conquest brought uncertainty and fear. Jewish communities faced immediate persecution under Nazi racial laws. Political dissidents were arrested, resistance networks began forming quietly, even as occupation authorities established control. Factories were redirected toward German production. Young men were conscripted for labor. The swift victories on the battlefield translated into years of hardship under occupation. For Britain, now isolated, the fall of France represented a strategic nightmare. The English Channel became the last barrier between Nazi domination of the continent and the British Isles. German forces stood along the French coast, gazing across the narrow stretch of water. Submarine bases soon operated from Atlantic ports, threatening shipping lanes. The balance of power in Europe had shifted dramatically in less than a year. In Berlin, confidence soared. Hitler's prestige reached its zenith. Generals who had doubted the risks of the Ardennes campaign were silenced by success. The rapid collapse of Europe's major powers reinforced Hitler's belief in his own intuition over traditional military caution. The lightning conquest seemed to validate his ideology and embolden further ambitions. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with growing concern but remained officially neutral. Many Americans believed the war was a distant European tragedy, yet reports of France's fall and Britain's peril stirred debate. The possibility that a single authoritarian regime could dominate Europe and potentially threaten global balance no longer seemed abstract. The first year of war had transformed the geopolitical landscape. What began with the invasion of Poland had escalated into continental upheaval. Germany's enemies were scattered, demoralized, and forced into defensive positions. The Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable, its tactics revolutionary, its leadership daring. In less than 12 months, the map of Europe had been redrawn with astonishing speed, and the momentum of conquest carried forward with an energy that suggested the lightning might continue striking further east, further south, reshaping the world in ways few had imagined possible just 1 year before. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. German troops lined the Atlantic coast from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. Across the English Channel, the Wehrmacht stared toward the white cliffs of Dover. The question was no longer whether Nazi Germany dominated continental Europe. It did. The question was whether Britain would be next. At the center of this looming confrontation stood two men whose wills seemed to define the fate of nations. Adolf Hitler in Berlin, confident after a cascade of victories, and Winston Churchill in London, newly appointed Prime Minister, defiant in the face of what many believed was inevitable defeat. One commanded an empire of conquest, the other commanded an island bracing for invasion. Hitler did not initially seek to annihilate Britain. He admired its empire, its naval tradition. He hoped, even after France's surrender, that Britain might negotiate peace. But Churchill refused. In Parliament and over the radio, he spoke not of compromise, but of resistance. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared, his voice carrying across a nation preparing for the worst. The words were not theatrical bravado. They were a promise that Britain would stand, even if standing meant standing alone. To invade Britain, Germany first needed control of the skies. Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious assault, depended on neutralizing the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority, German barges crossing the Channel would be slaughtered by British aircraft and naval forces. The task fell to the Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, who assured Hitler it could crush British defenses within weeks. Thus began the Battle of Britain. It started quietly in July 1940 with probing attacks on shipping convoys and coastal installations. German bombers tested British radar coverage and fighter response times. But soon the assault intensified. Waves of Messerschmitt fighters escorted Heinkel and Dornier bombers toward airfields in southern England. The targets were precise: runways, hangars, radar stations, aircraft factories. The objective was simple: destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. What made Britain's defense possible was not only courage, but preparation. The Dowding system, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, integrated radar detection, ground observers, and centralized command centers. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming formations long before they reached their targets. Information flowed to operations rooms, where controllers directed fighter squadrons to intercept. It was a network defense, efficient and modern, turning limited resources into maximum impact. The young pilots of the RAF, many barely out of training, became the thin blue line between survival and occupation. Flying Hurricanes and Spitfires, they scrambled daily, sometimes multiple times, climbing rapidly to meet incoming bombers. Combat at altitude was chaotic and lethal. Aircraft twisted through clouds, machine guns rattling, smoke trailing from damaged engines. Pilots who survived one dogfight often faced another hours lat. Losses mounted on both sides. German bombers, though formidable, were vulnerable without fighter escort. British airfields suffered heavy damage. At times, the RAF teetered on the edge of collapse. Fighter command was strained. Pilots were exhausted. Replacement aircraft arrived from factories, but trained pilots were harder to replace. For a brief, terrifying period in late August 1940, it seemed the Luftwaffe might achieve its objective. Then came a pivotal shift. In retaliation for a British bombing raid on Berlin, small in scale but symbolically significant, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to redirect its attacks toward London and other major cities. The focus moved from airfields and radar stations to urban centers. The Blitz began. Night after night, sirens wailed across London. Families descended into underground stations, clutching blankets and children. Bombs fell indiscriminately, igniting fires that lit the sky red. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral stood amid smoke and flame, an image that would become emblematic of endurance. Civilians became targets, and the psychological dimension of the war deepened. Yet the shift in strategy had unintended consequences. By easing pressure on RAF airfields and radar installations, the Luftwaffe allowed fighter command to recover. Damaged runways were repaired, squadrons reorganized. Pilots gained precious breathing room. The battle that had been tilting toward Germany began to rebalance. The skies over southern England remained contested. On September 15, 1940, in what would later be remembered as Battle of Britain Day, massive German formations approached London in daylight. RAF fighters intercepted them in force. Dogfights raged above the capital. By the end of the day, German losses were severe enough to force reconsideration. The Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority at acceptable cost. Meanwhile, Britain's resilience confounded German expectations. Rather than break morale, the bombing raids hardened it. Civilians emerged from shelters to clear debris and reopen shops. Buses ran. Factories resumed production. Churchill toured bombed districts, offering visible solidarity. The British press reported destruction but emphasized defiance. The Blitz inflicted suffering, but it failed to shatter national will. Across the Channel, preparations for invasion stalled. Barges assembled in French ports remained vulnerable without air cover. The Royal Navy, though stretched, still dominated the seas. Without control of the skies, Operation Sea Lion became a gamble too dangerous to attempt. In October 1940, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The implications of Britain's survival were profound. Had the RAF been destroyed and Britain forced to negotiate, Germany would have consolidated control over Western Europe without fear of a Western front. The Atlantic would have become a German-dominated sphere. American support for Britain, already increasing through measures like Lend-Lease, might never have materialized in the same way. The Soviet Union, when invaded in 1941, would have faced a Germany unthreatened in the West. Instead, Britain became a fortress and a staging ground. Its airfields would later launch bombing campaigns against Germany. Its shores would serve as the departure point for Allied troops on D-Day. The island that stood alone in 1940 would become the spearhead of liberation in 1944. The Battle of Britain was not the largest battle of the war in terms of casualties or territory. It was fought in the air, often unseen by those on the ground except as distant specks against the sky. Yet its significance lay in what it prevented. It halted the momentum of Blitzkrieg. It marked the first major defeat of Hitler's war machine. It proved that Germany could be resisted and beaten. For Hitler, the failure to subdue Britain was more than a tactical setback. It was a strategic obstacle that would shape every decision thereafter. Unable to secure the West, he turned eastward toward the Soviet Union, opening a vast new front while Britain remained unconquered behind him. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the fate of Europe hung in the balance above the fields and cities of southern England. Radar operators scanning their screens, mechanics refueling aircraft in haste, pilots strapping into cockpits with trembling hands, all played roles in a struggle that would determine whether the shadow over Europe deepened into permanent night or whether a flicker of resistance would endure against overwhelming odds. On June 22, 1941, the fragile illusion of partnership between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shattered at dawn. Without a formal declaration of war, more than 3 million German soldiers surged across a frontier that stretched nearly 1,800 miles. It was the largest invasion force in human history. The operation bore a name that evoked medieval conquest, Barbarossa, and it was conceived by Adolf Hitler not merely as a military campaign, but as an ideological crusade. For Hitler, the war in the East was different. It was not simply about territory or strategic advantage. It was about Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and the destruction of what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. The Soviet Union was to be dismantled, its lands colonized, its people subjugated or eliminated. This was a war of annihilation from the outset, and its brutality would eclipse even the devastation already witnessed in Poland and Western Europe. The German plan relied on speed and shock, the same principles that had crushed France. 3 army groups would advance simultaneously. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South toward Ukraine and the oil-rich Caucasus. Tanks spearheaded the assault, supported by artillery and waves of Luftwaffe bombers that struck Soviet airfields before many aircraft could even take off. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled in vast pockets. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched into captivity. In the first weeks, the scale of German success seemed almost surreal. Soviet command structures were paralyzed. Communications failed. Many Red Army units fought bravely but were overwhelmed by the coordination and mobility of the Wehrmacht. At Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kiev, massive encirclements resulted in catastrophic Soviet losses. Roads were clogged with retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians. The German advance appeared unstoppable. Part of this initial collapse stemmed from Joseph Stalin's own miscalculations. Despite warnings from intelligence sources that Germany was preparing to attack, Stalin hesitated to mobilize fully, fearing provocation. When the invasion began, Soviet forces were caught in vulnerable forward positions. Purges of experienced military officers during the 1930s had weakened leadership. Confusion reigned in the first days of war. Yet even amid disaster, the Soviet Union possessed advantages Germany underestimated. Its vast geography absorbed the shock. Industries in western regions were dismantled and transported eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, where they resumed production out of reach of German bombers. Millions of citizens were mobilized. The Red Army, though battered, did not disintegrate. As summer turned to autumn, German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Army Group North approached Leningrad, initiating a siege that would last nearly 900 days. Civilians there faced starvation and relentless bombardment. Army Group South advanced through Ukraine, seizing agricultural resources and moving toward the Caucasus. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, capturing Smolensk and advancing steadily despite stiffening resistance. By September 1941, the Wehrmacht stood closer to total victory in the east than it ever would again. Soviet casualties were staggering. Entire armies had been lost. German reconnaissance units glimpsed the spires of Moscow in the distance. Some German officers believed the Soviet state was on the verge of collapse. Hitler himself grew confident that the campaign would be concluded before winter, but cracks began to show. Logistics strained under the immense distances. Roads in the Soviet Union were primitive compared to those in Western Europe. Rail gauges differed, requiring time-consuming conversion. Supplies of fuel and ammunition struggled to keep pace with advancing columns. Vehicles broke down. Horses, still essential for German transport, collapsed from exhaustion. Then came the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud. Seasonal rains turned roads into swamps. Tanks bogged down. Trucks became immobilized. The advance slowed dramatically. Momentum, the essence of Blitzkrieg, faltered. Soviet resistance stiffened as reinforcements arrived from Siberia. Troops hardened by cold and newly equipped. Hitler's strategic decisions further complicated matters. Instead of concentrating exclusively on Moscow, he diverted forces south to encircle Kiev, achieving a massive tactical victory, but delaying the central thrust toward the Soviet capital. Time slipped away. When the drive on Moscow resumed in October under Operation Typhoon, winter loomed. The cold arrived early and with ferocity. German soldiers equipped for a short summer campaign lacked adequate winter clothing. Weapons malfunctioned in sub-zero temperatures. Engines froze overnight. Frostbite and exhaustion took their toll. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, accustomed to the climate and bolstered by fresh reserves, launched counteroffensives in December. For the first time in the war, German forces were pushed back on a large scale. The myth of invincibility cracked. Moscow did not fall. The Soviet government did not collapse. The Red Army demonstrated a capacity to absorb staggering losses and continue fighting. Still, the campaign was far from decided. In 1942, Hitler renewed his push, this time focusing on the southern front. The objective shifted toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad along the Volga River. Oil was critical. Without it, Germany's mechanized armies would grind to a halt. Capturing these resources promised strategic leverage. Yet the decision to split forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus diluted strength. German armies stretched across immense distances, their flanks guarded by Allied troops from Romania, Hungary, and Italy, less well equipped for the brutal fighting ahead. As urban combat erupted in Stalingrad, the battle transformed into a grinding struggle of attrition. Buildings were reduced to rubble. Soldiers fought from cellar to rooftop. The Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942 encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, trapping more than 250,000 men. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled troops by air. It could not. Starvation and frost consumed the trapped army. In February 1943, the remnants surrendered. Operation Barbarossa had begun with astonishing momentum and visions of swift triumph. It devolved into a protracted war of attrition that Germany was ill-prepared to sustain. The vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the unforgiving climate combined to transform the invasion into a quagmire. The gamble against the Soviet Union was rooted in overconfidence. Hitler believed the campaign would last months, not years. He underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and the willingness of its citizens to endure unimaginable suffering. He believed ideological conviction could substitute for logistical preparation. Instead of defeating one opponent at a time, he committed Germany to a colossal two-front war, while Britain remained unconquered and the United States edged closer to full involvement. By the end of 1941, Germany had inflicted immense damage, but failed to achieve decisive victory. By the end of 1942, the strategic initiative was slipping away. The war in the East became a brutal, grinding contest that consumed men and material on a scale never before seen. What had begun as a lightning invasion intended to secure domination instead became the turning of the tide. As the Soviet Union regrouped, adapted, and prepared to push westward with a force that would eventually carry it all the way to Berlin. By the late summer of 1942, the war in the East had already consumed millions of lives, yet one city along the western bank of the Volga River would become the symbol of a turning tide. Its name carried political weight as much as strategic importance: Stalingrad. For Adolf Hitler, capturing the city was more than a military objective. It was personal. To seize the city that bore Joseph Stalin's name would be a psychological blow, a statement that the Soviet Union could be humiliated at its core. The German summer offensive of 1942 had pushed deep into southern Russia. Army Group South split into two massive thrusts, one toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the other toward the Volga. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare. Without secure fuel supplies, tanks would stall, aircraft would sit idle, and mechanized divisions would become stranded relics. Hitler believed that by capturing the Caucasus fields and cutting the Volga supply route at Stalingrad, he could cripple the Soviet war machine. By August, the Luftwaffe had begun bombarding Stalingrad relentlessly. Waves of bombers turned factories, apartment blocks, and rail yards into ruins. Thousands of civilians were killed in the opening days. Smoke choked the skyline. Fires burned for weeks. What had been an industrial city became a shattered landscape of twisted steel and broken masonry. Yet the destruction created a paradox. The rubble that German bombers believed would break Soviet resistance instead provided defensive cover. Soviet soldiers dug into collapsed buildings, turning each ruin into a fortress. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the defenders adopted tactics that brought them as close to German lines as possible, so close that German artillery and air support risked hitting their own troops. The battle devolved into savage, intimate combat. German forces, led by General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, entered the city expecting to secure it within days. Instead, they encountered a nightmare. Streets changed hands repeatedly. Snipers stalked from shattered windows. Factories such as the Red October and the Tractor Factory became battlefields unto themselves. Soldiers fought room to room, floor by floor, sometimes separated from the enemy by only a wall. The term Rattenkrieg, Rat War, captured the claustrophobic brutality of the struggle. For the men on both sides, Stalingrad was not a sweeping maneuver campaign, but a grinding contest of endurance. Supplies had to be ferried across the Volga under constant bombardment. Soviet reinforcements crossed the river at night, often under artillery fire. Many never reached the shore. German troops, exhausted and undersupplied, pressed forward inch by inch. Casualties mounted relentlessly. By October 1942, much of the city lay in German hands. The Volga itself seemed within reach. Observers in Berlin believed victory was imminent, yet beyond the smoking ruins, Soviet commanders were preparing something larger. While German attention remained fixed on the city, Soviet forces massed along the flanks, where Axis allied armies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, held extended defensive lines with fewer resources and weaker equipment. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Massive artillery barrages preceded armored thrusts that smashed through the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad. Within days, Soviet pincers met near Kalash, encircling the German Sixth Army and parts of the Fourth Panzer Army. More than 250,000 Axis troops found themselves trapped inside a tightening ring. The shock was profound. For the first time in the war, a full German field army was surrounded on such a scale. Paulus requested permission to break out while escape was still possible. Several German commanders urged withdrawal to save the army. But Hitler refused. He declared Stalingrad a fortress that must be held at all costs. Goering assured him that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled troops by air. The promise proved hollow. The vast numbers of men required hundreds of tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, medical equipment, fuel, weather conditions, Soviet anti-aircraft and limited transport aircraft capacity made consistent delivery impossible. Supplies trickled in, insufficient to sustain the trapped army. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Ammunition dwindled. Frostbite spread as temperatures plunged. Winter in the Russian steppe was merciless. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters carved from rubble. Medical facilities overflowed with wounded men who lacked proper treatment. Starvation weakened bodies already strained by months of combat. Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, launching assaults to shrink the perimeter. Outside the pocket, German attempts at relief faltered. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein mounted Operation Winter Storm in December 1942, pushing toward the trapped army from the south. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Relief forces came within striking distance, yet without permission to attempt a coordinated breakout, Paulus remained pinned. Soviet counterattacks halted Manstein's advance. The opportunity slipped away. Inside Stalingrad, the situation deteriorated into despair. Units fragmented. Communication faltered. Discipline eroded under the strain of hunger and cold. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in January 1943, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered at before, a symbolic gesture intended to imply that Paulus should fight to the death rather than capitulate. The message was unmistakable, but symbolic gestures could not conjure food or ammunition. By late January, Soviet forces split the pocket into two smaller encirclements. German resistance crumbled under relentless pressure. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern group. 2 days later, the northern group followed. Approximately 90,000 German soldiers went into captivity. Tens of thousands more had already perished. Only a fraction would ever return home. The surrender at Stalingrad sent shockwaves through Germany and the wider world. It was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophe. An entire army annihilated. The aura of invincibility that had followed the Wehrmacht since 1939 was shattered beyond repair. German families received letters informing them that sons and husbands were missing or dead. Mourning spread across the Reich. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was both a military triumph and a moral vindication. The Red Army had not only halted the German advance, but reversed it decisively. The victory galvanized Soviet morale and strengthened alliances with Britain and the United States. It demonstrated that Germany could be encircled, overwhelmed, and forced to surrender. Strategically, the defeat marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. German forces would never again regain the initiative in the same way. Subsequent offensives, including the massive tank battle at Kursk later in 1943, failed to restore momentum. The Red Army began a relentless push westward, retaking territory city by city. Stalingrad symbolized the collapse of the Eastern Dream, the belief that the Soviet Union could be crushed in a single decisive campaign. Instead, the invasion had transformed into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Resources drained away, experienced troops were lost, Allied bombing intensified in the West. The balance of power shifted irreversibly. What began as an ambitious drive toward oil and dominance ended in frozen ruins along the Volga. The shattered factories and silent streets of Stalingrad bore witness to the cost of overreach, as the momentum that once seemed unstoppable turned inward, eroding the very foundations of the Reich's war machine and setting in motion a chain of offensives that would carry Soviet forces steadily westward toward the heart of Nazi Germany. By 1943, the shape of the war had changed. Not everyone yet understood it. The vast empire carved out by Nazi Germany still stretched across much of Europe. German soldiers still occupied foreign capitals. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic. Rockets and new weapons were in development. On the surface, the Reich appeared formidable. But beneath that appearance lay a growing imbalance, one rooted not just in battlefield defeats, but in strategy, industry, and the consequences of ambition pushed too far. From the beginning, Adolf Hitler had waged war with audacity. Boldness had brought success in Poland and France. Risk had paid off in the Ardennes. Speed had overwhelmed opponents before they could adapt. Yet the very instinct that fueled early triumphs became a liability as the conflict widened. Instead of consolidating gains, Hitler expanded objectives. Instead of narrowing fronts, he opened new ones. By declaring war on the United States in December 1941, days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany transformed a European war into a truly global confrontation. The industrial capacity of the United States dwarfed that of Germany. American factories, once fully mobilized, began producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and trucks in numbers previously unimaginable. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines at astonishing speed, airfields filled with bombers destined for Europe. The scale of production shifted the war from a contest of maneuver to a contest of resources. Germany could not match it. The Reich had impressive engineering and disciplined industry, but it was constrained by limited access to raw materials and by internal inefficiencies. Competing power structures within the Nazi regime created overlapping authorities. Ideological priorities often interfered with practical ones. Forced labor from occupied territories supplemented the workforce, but it could not replace the stability and productivity of a unified industrial base. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, factories in cities like Hamburg and the Ruhr faced mounting destruction. In the east, the Red Army recovered from earlier disasters and reorganized on a scale that astonished German planners. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the reach of most German bombers, began producing tanks such as the T-34 in massive quantities. Artillery, aircraft, and ammunition flowed steadily to the front. The Red Army adapted tactics, improved coordination, and learned from earlier failures. Each German defeat compounded the strategic pressure. Hitler's refusal to permit tactical withdrawals further strained the Wehrmacht. Cities were declared fortresses to be held at all costs. Retreats that might have preserved manpower were delayed or forbidden. Commanders who advocated flexibility found themselves overruled. The principle of elastic defense, trading space for time, was often sacrificed to ideological insistence on unwavering resistance. The result was encirclement after encirclement, attritional losses that Germany could not replace at the same rate as its enemies. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, Axis fortunes faltered. The North African campaign ended with the surrender of German and Italian forces in Tunisia in May 1943. Allied troops invaded Sicily and later mainland Italy. Italy's government collapsed, and though German forces continued fighting on Italian soil, the Axis alliance weakened. Another front demanded troops, equipment, and attention. The Atlantic also turned against Germany. Advances in radar, sonar, and code breaking, most notably the deciphering of the Enigma cipher, allowed Allied navies to track and destroy U-boats with increasing effectiveness. What had once been a lethal threat to transatlantic supply lines became a costly struggle for German submariners. Merchant convoys arrived in Britain with rowing regularity, sustaining the island that had survived alone in 1940. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The long-anticipated Second Front in Western Europe had begun. Troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations established a foothold on the beaches. Despite fierce resistance, they expanded inland. The industrial power that had been building across the Atlantic now manifested in columns of vehicles, endless supplies, and air superiority that dominated the skies. Germany now faced the full weight of a two-front war, Soviet armies advancing from the east, Anglo-American forces pressing from the west, and strategic bombing campaigns striking cities and infrastructure daily. Rail networks were disrupted. Fuel shortages grew acute. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, struggled with pilot losses and dwindling aviation fuel. New technologies, such as the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, inflicted damage but could not reverse strategic realities. Hitler's leadership style intensified the crisis. Increasingly isolated, he relied on a shrinking circle of loyalists. Distrust of generals deepened after assassination attempts and perceived disloyalty. Decisions were centralized to an extreme degree, often based on incomplete information or ideological conviction rather than battlefield necessity. The flexibility that modern warfare demanded was replaced by rigid directives. German soldiers continued to fight with determination. Defensive battles in places like the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 demonstrated that the Wehrmacht retained the capacity for surprise and ferocity. The offensive initially achieved breakthroughs, exploiting gaps in Allied lines. For a brief moment, hope flickered that a decisive blow might split Allied forces and force negotiations. But the offensive lacked sufficient fuel, air support, and reserves. Once the Allies regrouped, German forces were pushed back, their remaining strength further depleted. As 1945 approached, the imbalance became overwhelming. Soviet offensives smashed through eastern defenses, capturing city after city. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, breaching Germany's last major natural barrier. Cities lay in ruins from bombing. Civilians fled advancing armies. Refugees crowded roads in desperate columns. The Third Reich had been built on momentum, on rapid offensives that stunned opponents into submission. Once that momentum stalled, once the war became industrial and attritional, the foundations began to crumble. Germany lacked the oil reserves to sustain prolonged mechanized warfare. It lacked the manpower to replace catastrophic losses indefinitely. It lacked the unified strategic clarity necessary to manage a global conflict against multiple industrial superpowers. Strategic overreach had transformed early victories into long-term liabilities. Conquered territories required occupation forces. Partisan resistance tied down divisions that might have reinforced front lines. Ideological brutality alienated populations that might otherwise have remained neutral or even cooperative. Resources were diverted into projects driven by prestige rather than practicality. By the spring of 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Allied forces converged from the west. The war that had once seemed poised for German domination ended amid ruins and surrender. The rise of Allied power, industrial, logistical, and numerical, had overwhelmed a regime that mistook early success for invincibility, and in expanding its ambitions beyond sustainable limits, ensured that the vast empire forged in lightning would ultimately collapse under the cumulative weight of enemies it had chosen to confront all at once. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.